Hey, 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 Facebook family. It is time for another live. So, y'all, come on in here, y'all. Tonight's topic is a really juicy one and one that's actually been on my heart to share for about 2 years now. Um, so, I want to share with you a little bit about the inspiration behind tonight's topic. Um, Tonight, we're going to be talking about the imbalance created in the collective by male spiritual teachers. And I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go a little bit in detail a bit about what the title of this actually means, but um, how this came up. The inspiration for this particular topic came up one in my hey everybody who's joining. I see you all here. Um, it came up one in my healing journey from kidney failure because the kidneys are about balance. They are the balancing organs of our systems. They keep our chemistry in balance. They keep the blood flow in balanced and clean. And the kidneys are about balance. They're literally the scales of the system of the body. And in order to heal myself, I had to learn a lot about balance because I was imbalanced. And I had to learn about how I was imbalanced, what actually I was imbalanced in. Not just, it wasn't just about food, it was about imbalanced in my consciousness, imbalanced in my vibration, in my energy field. I had to learn a lot about balance and a lot more than what people were talking about. A lot more than, and I learned a lot more than what people are teaching. As a matter of fact, this particular topic we're going to talk about, I've only ever heard one other person talk about this, and that's Anita Morjani. Anita Morjani has talked about this a bit. And she was the only other person I had heard ever speak about this, and I was learning this as well in my journey. And I guess maybe it's because both of us have had near-death experiences, and maybe it's a part of that. But anyway, I learned a lot about balance and what balance is and what it actually is and how we're not being actually, I won't say truly taught, I'll say effectively taught, like wholly taught about what balance actually takes and what it means for us as soul beings having human experiences. And then the other part of this that it led me to the inspiration to talk about this was, I've been working now as a channel and as an intuitive guide and helping people heal and manifest and transform their lives. I've been working now doing this work for about, over 10 years. And I've worked with people all over the world. I've worked with people almost in every continent now. Um, and a lot of the majority of the people that I've worked with, not all of them, but the majority of people that I worked with have been women. And I've been seeing something, this pattern that's been going on in the spiritual community, and people who are spiritual seekers, and people who are, having awakenings, and now they're into spiritual growth, and they study spiritual principles and books and things like that. I've noticed this pattern that's been happening with women, and when I ask my guides, why is this the case? That I see this a lot in the women, but I don't see this a lot in the men that I have been working with. I do see it in the men, but not as much. And I was thinking, what is this? I see this thing, this imbalance happening a lot in the women. And so, what is this? And as I began to learn about my own journey, about how to heal myself and how to bring my own self into balance, and then I was seeing this also happening with the people I was working with, and I was asking for higher guidance. So anytime I have something that I want higher guidance for, which means I want the broadest perspective on this, I want the highest vibrational understanding on the topic, I will ask my guides around it, or I'll tune into and I'll ask my higher self. And so this is kind of what was shared with me and what was shown with me, and this was a huge thing for me in my own healing, in my healing my own body, and healing my own life. And this has been I've worked with this with other people, and it's really helped them. And again, this is very going to be a very excuse me, this may be very radical for some of you all, because we've been taught a lot of what we've been taught, even in the spirituality field, um is not the whole picture. Let me say it like that. It's not the whole picture. And a lot of what we've been taught is imbalanced. So this I'm going to share this topic today. So what I want to talk about today is the imbalance in the spiritual community that was created by male spiritual teachers. So to start this off, if you've been following some of my live videos, especially if you followed me when I did the videos where I was talking about transcending racism from the soul's perspective, you heard me talk a lot about the balance of the consciousness and how, as a soul being, you have two parts to your consciousness. Now, we're not really taught that. We're taught that, you just have this one consciousness, but there are two sides to your consciousness, just like you have two sides to your brain, right? Just like you have two, and I'll call them hemispheres, just like you have two hemispheres to your brain. And the very the thing about this is the physical mirrors the spiritual. It is the reflection of the internal world, which is the spiritual world. The physical world is not the creative world. It's not the world where creation happens. The internal world is where creation happens. This is the reflection world. And the body is a reflection of the internal world as well. So you have these two hemispheres of the brain. You have the left and right hemisphere, and those two hemispheres, they do different things. They're in charge of different things, and they operate very differently from each other. And they're not, although it's one part of the brain, you have these two kind of sides that operate different things, right? So like the right side of the brain is in control of your creativity. It's in control of your intuition. It's in control of your passions and your emotional senses. It's in control of there's something else I'm forgetting around that, but in any way, you get the kind of gist of that. And the left side of the brain is where your language is. It's where your more logical thinking comes in, and your science and math type stuff, your linear aspects of your thinking and things like that. That's where that side of the brain is, and also um, the left side of the brain is also more of the concrete concepts. And so you have these two sides of the brain, and you need to be in both sides, right? You need to operate in both of these aspects. You don't need to only be in the right side of your brain. Like, nobody would say, oh my God, the left side of your brain is an evil thing, cut it out. Right? You need both hemispheres of the brain so that you can operate, because without both, like without the right side of the brain, you won't be creative. You won't haven't touched with your emotions. You won't have things. You won't be in touch with your intuition or your creativity or your talents. Without the left side of the brain, you won't be able to have language and really speak. You won't be able to do, math and science. You won't be able to do things like that. And this is evident when if you've ever studied people who've had a stroke, and they've had a stroke on a certain side of the brain, on one hemisphere of the side of the brain, it disables the abilities on that hemisphere. And not only does it disable it, but by the way, the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. So, anyway, so if you ever known anybody who's had a stroke, and follow me, you guys, if this is going to make all the sense, I'm laying the foundation for this today. So if you've ever known anybody who's had a stroke and has stroked out an entire part of the brain, you know that when that side of the brain, they don't have access to that part. And a brilliant book for you all to read is called Stroke of Insight by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, who was a neuroscientist who had a stroke. And she had a stroke, and it stroked out the left side of her brain. And she talks about, she was aware and conscious when she had the stroke, and she talks about very in detail about what she experienced. She experienced this sense of oneness. She experienced a sense of oneness with everything, and she couldn't really tell where, like, her hands began and like the room stopped, and she couldn't really, and this made it hard to actually pick up the phone and call for help. And when she did pick up the phone and call for help, she couldn't really speak because she didn't have language. She didn't have access to language. And so she had called somebody, but she couldn't really, when she thought she was speaking, but the other person wasn't hearing any words or any clear sentences, because that's the left side of the brain. Also, she couldn't delineate like who people were. Like, she couldn't delineate the differences between people, but she could feel them. She could feel their energy. right? Because that's also, again, the right side of the brain is like oneness. And you'll understand this here in just a second. I'm about to really bring it in. So she was talking about she didn't have access to the left side of the brain. And she noticed all of these things that the left side of the brain was, but she was more left brain dominant in her work. She was a neuroscientist. She was taught to not even look at the emotions and the feelings and all that. And this opened her up to a whole new world that was available to her that she had not been operating by and didn't even know existed. And so she talked about how her healing after that and how she lives her life now is to be very integrated with both of these sides. So why is this important? Why does this have to do with what I'm talking about? Well, you have two hemispheres to your consciousness, but about we have been taught to demonize heavily one side of that hemisphere. And the two sides of your consciousness are the soul side and the ego side. Now, the soul side is actually connected to the right side of your brain. So that's the part of your consciousness where you're going to have empathy, where you're going to be see things from the side of oneness. You're going to see things from the side of love and compassion. You're going to be very creative. You're going to be in your emotional. You're going to be in tune with your emotions, and you're going to be highly in tune with your intuition. We have been taught by the spiritual field for many years that this is how you're supposed to live your life, only in this side. And remember what I said before, it's just like if I told you you were only supposed to live in the right side of your brain and never have access to the left side, right? Look at how much, if we were talking just in the hemispheres of brain, you would be so out of balance and you would not be able to actually operate in the world, just like Jill Bolte Taylor, who had the stroke, right? She couldn't even operate. She had to get help. And she couldn't operate until she could heal that side of her brain again, right? And so, but this is the same type of thing we're taught in spirituality. We're taught soul consciousness, no soul consciousness, and the ego consciousness is bad. And we've been taught by years. I'm going to tell you why. So this is what's happened initially. So spiritual teachers initially were men. They were men in the East. So in India, in China, and all of that, they were the big teachers. They were men, and they were talking to. But who was attracted to spirituality in the beginning was women. It was women. That's who you could ask any spiritual teacher that's been in the game for a while. The majority of the people that come to the events, the majority of the people that were sitting in the ashrams, the majority of the people that were taking the yoga class, they were women. But the men were leading, the men were teaching, and the men were talking about, like, you need to suppress the ego. You need to come out of ego consciousness. The ego is bad, 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 and just be in the soul consciousness. And the reason why the men were teaching this is because men, if you were a soul who incarnated into a male body in the last like 200, 300 years especially, this part of humanity, the male body, is ego dominant. It is ego dominant. And I talked a little bit about what the soul side of the consciousness is. But the ego side of the consciousness is the part of us that allows you to be an empowered self. An empowered self. So it's the part of you that is in charge of, again, remember, it's connected to the left side of the brain. So it's connected to you being able to speak up for yourself. It's connected to your ability to say no to things that don't serve you or that you don't want to do. The ego is the part of you where you're clear about what your desires are and your dreams are and what your goals are. And the ego part of you is the part of you that allows you to stand in your power and have boundaries. The ego part of your consciousness is the part that empowers and nourishes the self. So here's where the imbalance comes from. So this is where men were very highly in that part of the consciousness, right? Because men were in this part of the world, in the past 300, 400 years especially, men were very in control. They could use their voice. They could speak up and go for what they dreamed of. They were in that. That was like the male privilege, right? And so they were very much in that part of their consciousness. But what they weren't in was the soul side of the consciousness. They weren't able to see the oneness between them and women. They weren't able to see the oneness with between them and another person, which is where wars and violence come from, right? They weren't able to see the connection of this. They weren't in that side of their consciousness. They weren't in the part of the consciousness that allows them to get in touch with their emotions and their intuition. So they became intellect led instead of intuition and intellect led, right? So what the soul comes here to do is to be integrated between the two, to be integrated with both of them. But what ended up happening was so many of us are either on one side or the other. Well, these male teachers were on the ego side, and when they had their awakening and they began to be more integrated, their awakening wasn't about increasing their ego consciousness because they were already strong in that. It was about increasing their soul consciousness. So their unfolding as a soul was about learning how to be more empathic, learning how to be more compassionate, learning how to understand oneness. And so that's what they taught. They taught heavy, 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 heavy that. But this is where the imbalance comes in. Who was the audience they were speaking to? They were speaking to women. And women, when you come as a soul being into a woman body, you're going to be more on the soul consciousness. So women were already compassionate. They were already in their emotions. They were already in this. And the men were teaching because the part where they were out of balance was in the ego side, because they were heavy overbalanced in the ego. So they were teaching not just oneness and empathy, but they were also teaching like the ego is bad. The ego is something that you don't need to have. The ego is something you need to demonize it and suppress it. So now you taught these women who were already suppressed in the ego to further suppress their ego. And this is why spiritual seekers who are women are often the most disempowered people I've ever met. This is what I was talking about in the beginning of the video when I was talking about the imbalance I was seeing in a lot of my clients. And what do I mean by they're the most disempowered? Spiritual seekers, especially women, have the hardest time making money and making a lot of it. They will make just enough to like get bills met or get their needs met, but not like an abundance of it, because again, that comes into nourishing the self and having a strong sense of self. They also are high people pleasers. And so they don't have boundaries. They don't have very strong and clear communicated and very well honored and fiercely protected boundaries. So people walk over them a lot. They'll be doormats a lot. They'll play small a lot. And they'll dim their lights in situations a lot. They'll know a lot about the chakras. They'll know a lot about, they'll see the auras, they can read energy, they have high spiritual gifts because that's the part of the soul consciousness, right? So they're very high in soul consciousness, and that's where that comes from. But they're struggling with money. They have a poor sense of self. They don't have, they often feel very victimized because they don't have this strong sense of empowerment of the self. And that's because the message that is constantly poured out in spirituality is to disconnect from that part of your consciousness that actually gives you access to all of that. And that's the ego part of your consciousness. That is where it is. The soul aspect of your consciousness is where empathy and oneness and creativity and art and compassion and high intuition and high psychic gifts, that's where all that is. The ego side of your consciousness is where your ability to speak up for yourself is, your ability to understand what you need in order for your well-being and what you individually need, not just the collective. You're now focused on as well as like, what do I need, right? And how do I get my needs met? This is another thing too. This is why a lot of women in the spiritual field don't get their needs met. They don't get their needs met for pleasure. They don't get their needs met for connection. They don't get their needs met for fulfillment. They have a hard time really doing what they really want to do in the world and getting the fulfillment that breathes through you through that. And that's because that's on the ego side of the consciousness. And so again, their soul consciousness is going up and up and up and up and up. And when you think about scales, remember I said I learned this from the kidneys. So if you think about the ego and the soul are scales, and they're supposed to be like this, right? Or at least very close to each other. Are higher on the ego part, right? They're out of balance. And so in order for men to balance, they need to raise up the soul side of their consciousness so that they now are more into their intuition, they're more into their emotions and feeling and expressing them, they're more into their talents and their gifts, they're more into their artistic and their creative expression, and things like that, right? That's what the integration is for men specifically, or for anyone who is more ego imbalanced, because there's a lot of different things we talked about. Like if you followed um, my transcending racism series, I talked about how souls that come into white bodies, especially into America, are more on the ego side of the consciousness as well. And so in order for them to balance, they have to be more soul consciousness. But here are these men over hundreds and hundreds of years teaching spirituality that are talking about this is where that whole thing came from. This is where it comes from. This is why we don't do enough like real connecting into the higher realms of consciousness to really see where a lot of the messages that we're getting, where they're actually coming from. And the messages that we have gotten in the field of spirituality for these years is suppress the ego. The ego is a bad thing. You don't need to have access to the ego. And what they're actually talking about is when you're out of balance in your ego, when you've been traumatized, right? Whenever you have trauma, you can go either way. You can go, but when you're trauma, when you come in as a child, you're more balanced in your consciousness. But then you get traumatized, and that balance goes either way. And it goes either you go into the ego so that you feel more separate instead of connected to everybody, and you feel like that's when you start to try to control everything. That's when you can try to you distrust, because trust is also on the soul side of the consciousness. You distrust things, you distrust life and the universe. You start to worry about other people's approval and things like that. If you get disimbalanced and you get traumatized, you get disimbalanced on the soul side of the consciousness, then you start to not have a strong sense of self. You start to feel a lot of shame around yourself. You start to compare yourself a lot to other people, especially your culture. Like, am I black enough? You start to, am I a woman? Am I as feminine or as attractive as these other women? That's when you start to get traumatized. You start to get the imbalance out of the soul consciousness. You start to conform a lot when you're out of balance on the soul consciousness, because remember, the soul consciousness is unity, it's oneness. And so you lose your sense of self, and you start to conform, and you start to lose your identity, your personal identity. So what we're talking about a lot is where we're attributing all of these aspects to the ego, and we've now demonized this part of us that we actually need. By the way, you actually need your ego. You can't escape it, because the ego part of the consciousness, when the soul decides to come in and have a human experience, when it's on the other side, you can call it heaven, you can call it the other realm, whatever you want to do. But before it becomes physical, in order to become physical, it has to create the ego, because the ego is the part of you that allows you to have a separate sense of self. If you did not have an ego anymore, you would not even have an identity at all. You would be everything. You would go back to oneness. You would go back to everything. So the part of source that wants to have the experiences of you as you creates an ego so that you can become human and you can have an experience of having a self. Without the ego, you lose all sense of self. And what I mean by all sense of it, I don't mean just like you're walking around feeling connected to everybody. You will actually lose your body, and you're going to cross over to the other side. Because the ego is the part that creates humanity. it creates the humanness and it creates the physical world, because the physical world is where you also have the experience of something being other than you. So this computer I'm talking to you through, that's something other than me. I have this experience of this chair being other than me. I have a sense of you over there listening to me being something other than me. When in reality, we're all one, but we're having this experience, this illusionary, this illusionary experience of us being separate, of us being a separate thing. And we wanted that. We wanted the experience of having me having a Jerome life. You wanted that of having you having a Ty life or a Debbie life or Ava life, right? You wanted the separate life. And if you suppress this ego so much and you so focus over here on the soul side, you get up and up and up and up and up and on the soul side, you're going to lose your humanity altogether. You came to be integrated. You came to have both. And for it to be balanced, you didn't come to be up here and down here. You came to be balanced. For the scales to be balanced. So I have a strong sense of myself. And so I have a strong sense of self, and I also have a strong sense of oneness. This is yes, as Tasha said, duality. This is what the duality is about. This is why this is the dimension of duality. You have the human self, you have the soul self. You have the right hemisphere of the brain, you have the left hemisphere of the brain, right? You have the divine masculine, you have the divine feminine, right? And you're supposed to be in both. You're supposed to be integrated into both. But male spiritual teachers over the years, and I just don't think they understood this, because they were coming from being very high in the ego. And when they began to have their spiritual awakenings and go through their spiritual healings, they began to become more balanced. And the balance for the males was to increase their soul consciousness. But their focus became that they began to teach it as this is what all balance is. This is what all spirituality is. This is what it's all about. It's only about increasing your understanding of oneness. It's only about increasing your empathy. And it's only about all these other practices, which are good and which you need to know about. But when you're already high in soul consciousness, your balance isn't to raise your soul consciousness even further. That's going to take you even further out of balance, which is what we're seeing. What we're seeing in spirituality now, not especially in women, but all across the board. This is why so many spiritual teachers, you find so many spiritual teachers out there who struggle with money. You find so many spiritual teachers out there who have terrible boundaries, and they're constantly getting walked over, and they're constantly not really shining their light, and they're playing small, and they have great gifts. Some of the best, because I noticed this in my journey. Some of the best, and when I talk about my journey, I used to work as psychic therapist. That's how it started. So I used to do readings, and I did mediumship readings and healings and all type of things like that as psychic therapist. That's how I first got started in this work, getting out, and I did them all over the country. And I began to know, because there's a circuit of people that do these fairs for their work to get their business out there and to get money. And so I began to know, I began to get familiar and be friends with a lot of different mediums out there and a lot of different channels out there. And there are some channels and there are some mediums and there are some people whose psychic gifts would blow your socks off. They are better, as far as like their skill set is better than anybody you know publicly. Guaranteed. But you never hear about them. You never hear about them. They're barely making ends meet financially. Why? Because they don't have a strong ego side of themselves. They haven't been taught that. One, they've been taught to demonize that part, so they're demonizing it. And then two, they've not been taught how to balance it, how to raise it up. And this is something I had to learn to heal my kidneys, by the way. So that when I talk to you about, like, this is what I was learning, what I learned in my journey was that I was so out of balance on the soul side of my consciousness. This is why I was a people pleaser. I was a doormat. People would walk all over me. I had a hard time saying no. I had a hard time, especially if it would cause conflict. I wasn't really going after my dreams and my goals. I didn't have boundaries anywhere. And what that led to was me being always feeling drained, me feeling always violated, and being resentful because I was feeling violated by other people because they weren't honoring me. Because how could they honor me? Because I didn't have boundaries. I wasn't honoring myself. And what I had to learn was what I needed wasn't more. And what I was trying in the beginning of my journey, what I was doing was like, I need to meditate more, and I need to be kinder, I need to be more compassionate, and I need to do, I need to be more empathy and oneness. And what they were showing me, what my guides finally were telling me is like, you're too out of balance over here. That's not what the problem is. That's not what made you sick. What made you sick was you don't have any sense of self. You don't have any sense of empowerment. You're not going after your dreams. You're not speaking up for yourself. You don't have a good relationship with saying no, which, by the way, no is the immune system of the spirit. It's literally the immune system of the body. You don't have you don't have the you don't use your voice. You don't speak up. So that's why I had a whole bunch of problems in my throat chakra area with thyroid disease, and all of these things. And I was like, oh my God, nobody's really teaching. Nobody's talking about this like this. And we're all over here, and connect with your angels, connect with your spirit guides, meditate, meditate, meditate. Just breathe and forgive. And we're not also teaching. And yes, do those things. But just as much as you do those things, speak up for yourself. Say no. Have healthy boundaries. Stop saying yes to everything that you want to say no to. Stop over giving of yourself. That's another thing that happens when you're imbalanced on the soul side. You just overgive, 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 overgive. Because what happens when you're in on the when you have when you're most soul consciousness dominant, what happens is you really care about people, which you should do. And you really care, but you care so much about them that you meet their needs and your needs never get met. And so you're malnourished, but they're full. They're nourished and full and healthy. And you're malnourished. Your needs are not met. And now you get sick. And you wonder why, because this used to be a conversation I used to hear all the time in psychic fairs. Why do really spiritual people like this person has cancer, this person has diabetes, or this person just got another like life-threatening illness, but they're so spiritual and they eat well. They're so spiritual. They're so spiritual. And I would say, like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by they're so spiritual? They're the nicest person I know. They would give you the shirt off their backs. They never cause any trouble. They never rile anything. They never, cause any conflict. They're just real easygoing. And I'd be like, that's what's killing them. They're not balanced. They're constantly being violated. They're constantly being walked over. They're constantly meeting other people's needs and showing up for other people and overgiving to where they're drained of their own energy and they don't even have their own energy in their body. And you know what helps you do that? To get more into your ego consciousness. But we're not taught about that. And this is why spirituality needs another revolution. It needs another one. Because we've had all of these people now, because men over the years have been teaching this, and now people have bought into that, and now everybody's teaching that. And the thing about it is, and again, it's not that the messages that they're teaching are wrong, because they're not. They're absolutely correct. And the things that they're teaching about and how to open the chakras and all of that is beautiful and necessary. But there's a whole other side of us that is going starving because we're not nourishing it and we're not balancing it. And this is why we're so imbalanced in spirituality. This is why also, spiritual teachers can also be the most nasty and the most, toxic. And not just teachers, but spiritual seekers can be the most toxic and the most nasty because you're not a balanced being. You're not in your wholeness. And when you do that, the ego doesn't get out of control. When you're balanced, the ego's not out of control because it's balanced. So now you have a strong sense of self, but you also understand that you're connected to the other person over there too, that we're one. And you have a both. You have the duality. You know how to take care of yourself, and you know how to make sure that they're taken care of, that what you're doing is not harming them. You understand both of those things. You understand I get my needs met, and I also can help you get your needs met, but after mine are met. I don't just meet your needs and then I'm starving, because then I start to resent you. This is why a lot of spiritual seekers, by the way, and if you are an energy healer, or if you read energy at all, you know I'm telling the truth. That's why most spiritual seekers have this underlying line in their energy of rage and resentment, but it's masked with these nice, nice platitudes and this sweetness and this kindness, but they have this underlining, like this river of resentment. Because, and where that river of resentment is coming from is this is it, we become resentful when we're constantly feeling violated, when we constantly feel used, when we're constantly being walked over, when we're constantly being having to meet other people's needs and our needs are still not met. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by your needs aren't met? Like, how many of you have helped people achieve their dreams, but your dreams haven't been achieved? How many of you have will show up for somebody and help them clean their house or help them cook a meal, but you don't have food cooked at your house for you? How many of you would, give? This is one thing people do. They give their services for free. Like, oh, I just think this person just really needs help. So they give this service for free. They give this service for free. Oh, I know this person can't pay, but I really feel for them, and they really want my help. So you give this help. You give this help over there. And you can't pay your bills. Your light bill is off. You barely able to make your mortgage. You can't help your child go to school. You can't buy your child what they really want, what you really want to buy them, because you don't even have enough money. But yet you have all the talents and all the skills, and you're just over giving to people who aren't even giving you any energy back. That's what that looks like when you're always meeting other people's needs and your needs aren't met. You're starving. You're starving for your own needs. And that, in order to do that, in order to be a being, a integrated being, a whole being, a balanced being, right? You've got to be operating out of both, to where I get my needs met. I understand who I am as a soul being, right? So let me just speak for me. This is what I had to learn to heal my kidneys. I had to learn how to, like, speak up. And if you watch me, I did a whole thing about the throat chakra and about saying what you need to say. I did a whole video series on that, right? This is what this is about. Like, I had to learn how to speak up. I had to learn how to say what I need to say, and stop suppressing it, and let my voice own the space. I had to learn how to say no. I had to learn how to. I was a chronic overgiver in every relationship I was ever in, and I'm not even talking about like lover relationships. I'm talking about friends. I'm talking about family. I'm talking about work. I was always the person just pouring out of my time, pouring out of my wisdom, pouring out of my resources, pouring out of my energy, and not getting it back equally. Always doing, just always showing up, always saying yes, always saying yes, always saying yes when I really wanted to say no because I didn't have the time. I was tired. That was something I really didn't even want to do. But I was trying to be nice. This is what the nice thing is to do. This is what the spiritual thing is to do. And I was always helping other people with their projects and not getting mine done. Even in my work, here I am. When I first started my business, I was a business mentor. I helped so many people, entrepreneurs, make six figures and seven figures. I helped so many people get on TV. I helped them, like, launch and create books. I helped so many people. My book wasn't written. I wasn't getting on TV. I wasn't making six and seven figures. But I've helped just hundreds, right? That's the always showing up, and not charging what my stuff is worth, all of that stuff, right? And that's because that's where the balance comes in. This is where we need to learn as soul beings, really, especially at this point of humanity. This is the next evolutionary step, where you learn to bring both sides of your consciousness into your body and how you operate from both sides of your consciousness in your life. This is what's not taught. And this is what was where the imbalance first started from. It started from because spiritual teachers were men. If you look at it historically, for a long time, they were men, but who they were talking to was women. And the men were talking about high soul consciousness because that's what they needed to balance as a man. But they were talking to women who needed ego consciousness. They needed to know how to be in their ego consciousness more. But the men told them that was evil. That's not spiritual, that's not high consciousness, that's not high vibrational. And so women further suppressed, further suppressed, further suppressed, further suppressed. And this is why even the most spiritual women of the time were very disempowered, and why we have this issue now in spirituality where a lot of spiritual seekers can tell you what color your aura is, can tell you how to clear your chakra. They can, speak with your deceased loved ones. They know all about love and about compassion and about empathy, which are all of those things are beautiful things. I have those things too. I teach those things too. But they know nothing about boundaries. They know nothing about really getting your dreams met and fulfilled. They know nothing about getting your needs met. They don't speak to anything about actually how to be a self and how to experience pleasure for yourself. And this is the thing that's been going on, and this is the thing that's been asking that the higher source is asking us to heal, and heal is really to bring into balance. And so we got to heal this, y'all. We got to stop just having these conversations that are one way in spirituality, because that's what now people think it is. Like, if people now think, if you even talk about those things, if you talk about money, if you talk about boundaries, if you talk about speaking up to yourself, if you talk about expressing anger, that's a huge one. Expressing anger. If you talk about, you know, um, what you want, like the I aspect of things, that's not spiritual. You're being too carnal. You're being too ego based. And so, what the only now association we have with spirituality is, if you have to be talking about angels and guides, you have to be talking about love and oneness. That's the big thing now. Like, everybody's talking about, you have to be talking about oneness in order to be talking spirituality. And that's the imbalance. And that's what I came on here to kind of just shine this light on, because now you're going to tip over this scale way over to where, again, you have this sense of oneness and collectiveness, which again, I'm not saying is a bad thing. I'm just saying it's out of balance, because you absolutely need to have an understanding of oneness, but there's a balance of oneness and I-ness, right? And um, like America, by the way, America is way out of balance on the ego side of things, which is why a lot of Americans need to really learn more about the soul consciousness, because we have individuality. We're high in individuality over here. We're high in me over here. We're high in not being connected. That's why we have an epidemic of loneliness here. Um, so, America needs to also learn how to raise the soul consciousness so it can be in balance. But women's particularly, and a lot of communities of color as well, because indigenous people and people of color are also very high in the soul consciousness. That's what allows you to have connection with the earth. That's what allows you to be very high in intuition, and to communicate with the dead. If indigenous people are very close to their dead. They're very close to the spiritual world. That's because you're very high in soul consciousness. But this is also when you're not in balance in ego consciousness. This is also when you can be taken advantage of, when you can become oppressed, which is why a lot of people of color across the world are the oppressed communities, right? You're oppressed because you don't have your own sense of you're not in your power and you're not using it. So this is the imbalance that was created by male spiritual teachers. And the answer is not just to have more women spiritual teachers. That's not the answer either. Although I'm all for it, for having more women spiritual teachers, but it's to have more spiritual teachers who are balanced, who are speaking the balance of the ego consciousness and the soul consciousness together, the right and the left brain together. How to live in the space where they are both, you're operating out of both instead of just operating out of one or the other. That's the next level of evolution for us. And that's the next level of humanity, when humanity knows how to do that, when we're balanced, when the people that are heavy on the ego side begin to balance with the soul side, the people that are on the soul side begin to balance it with the ego side. That's when the new level of human is going to come in. And we're not really there yet because we're still preaching this one side over the other. It's both and. It's both and. And that's how you heal. You heal the ego wounds by raising the soul consciousness to where you're balanced. You heal the soul wounds by raising the ego consciousness so that you're balanced. You don't suppress the soul. By the way, it's not about suppressing anything. This is I need to. I'll end on this. Like if you're imbalanced over here, like if this is the scale and the this is how the soul scale works. So if you're over here with the ego consciousness and your soul consciousness is down here, you don't suppress the ego consciousness to bring it down here. That's not balanced. Balance happens like this. You always raise up when it comes to a soul. So you need to raise your soul. You need to, if you're imbalanced with the ego consciousness, you raise the soul consciousness to the high, to that same level, and then you're balanced. The same thing over here. If you're high in soul consciousness and you're low in ego consciousness, you don't suppress the soul consciousness to get down here to the ego level. You raise the ego consciousness level up, and then you'll be balanced. You always raise the other side up. You never just suppress and depress the other side. That leads to illness as well. Suppression is not healing. Suppression is not wholeness. You want to raise it up. You want to raise the other side up. And as the other side raises up, it will heal the imbalances that are happening on the other side of your consciousness. Okay? So I don't see any questions. Maybe I was missing some. Um, Someone says, is this like the butterfly effect? To be honest, I don't remember exactly what the butterfly effect is. I know I've heard it. I know at one time I did know what that was. But I haven't been studying that particularly, so I can't speak on it. I don't want to say yes or no and it'd be absolutely wrong. That's not what I mean because I can't remember the details of the what the butterfly effect is. So I can't really answer that question. Currently, I probably will answer it in another video when I research, when I go back and I say, oh, yeah, that's what it was. Okay, yeah, I got it. But right now, I can't off the top of my head even remember what it is. Um, so, yeah. So, thank you guys for tuning in. As always, I love you. I hope this has helped you understand yourself a little bit more. And I hope this helps you expand into a higher level of well being, because that's what you're here for. That's what you're worthy of. That's what you deserve. And that's what your soul intended for you. And balance is the way there. So here's to more ego expressions and more soul balanced expressions. Until next time, I love you. Now go love yourself. Bye.